walked in Montgomery, I sat in Tennessee. Now I'm riding for equality. Hallelujah, I'm traveling. Hallelujah, ain't it fine?
Hi everyone, thanks for coming along and coming to this talk, which is called From the Freedom Riders and the Southern Way of Life to Insulate Britain and the Carbon Way of Life. It's important to say and state that we're holding this meeting currently at an absolute critical point in this planet. We're in a planetary emergency, and there are animals and people right now who are on the front line of climate change who are suffering and dying, and it's important to hold them in our hearts and minds as we do this difficult work. So yes, I suppose just before I hand over to Rowan and Roger, just to give this a bit of a framing, we'd just like to stress in that this is very much a subjective view of the Freedom Riders, and our intention is not to appropriate their struggle, or that we can say that we understood what it was like to be in their shoes. If anything, I think I can say for everyone who's worked on this, it's kind of like a love letter to them, really. We've been really inspired by their brave actions, and just what an incredible example of non-violent discipline and the courageous determination that they showed when the movement was against them, and also just what they achieved in terms of legislative change and what they showed the world really at that point. So I hope that's really clear. That's our intention as we go through this. So we're going to be showing clips from the PBS documentary, Freedom Riders, and then sort of switching in and out between Roger and Rowan, who will be talking through elements of it. Apologies if you see my face sometimes as I'm sort of doing the clips and things, so hopefully that will go fairly smoothly, but we shall see, because it's the first time I've done it. So let's just pass over to Roger and Rowan. Roger's, you probably already know, Roger's co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and Burning Pink, and Rowan is a long-time activist since the 80s, who's been involved in many different things, including the Seeds of Hope Ploughshares, and is currently very busy embedding non-violent discipline into Extinction Rebellion. So I want to say thank you all for coming. I hope you find the talk interesting, and I shall pass over to Roger, who you'll need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much everyone for coming along. This is a very exciting occasion as far as I'm concerned, because we're looking at some an amazing episode in history, which is massively challenging and massively inspiring at the same time. So I'm going to just give one or two introductory comments. I don't know if I'm crossing over with Rowan, so sorry, Rowan, if I am. But I think we're both going to make one or two introductory comments, and then as just been said, we'll be looking at a few clips and making some comments. But I just want to set the scene by just reiterating what Dave has just said, that the point of looking at history is not to pretend that it's exactly the same as today, but also not to make the other error to think that there aren't connections between what happens in history and what's happening today. And it's useful to recognize that the civil rights movement in the States in the 60s was very much inspired consciously by the experience of Gandhi's struggle against the British occupation of India in the 1930s and 40s, which obviously was very different to the situation in many ways to the American South in the 1960s. And similarly, of course, our situation is very different in many ways to what was happening in the 1960s. However, the main point I think we're going to be trying to put across is that in all situations of oppression and immorality and the abuse of power, there are always similar dynamics. And these dynamics are replicated over and over again through historical episodes. So that's really what we're looking at here. We're looking at how to deal with the injustice of power and how to challenge that. And that's really, for me, the overall theme. And that's why we're sort of going to be referring to the Insulate Britain project in many ways, the similarities between that and the episode of the Freedom Riders, which we'll come on to discuss. The other thing I want to just say is, this is, I don't know about everyone else, but I suspect everyone will probably agree with this, is it's a very intense experience watching the civil rights movement in action in detail in that time. And I just want to acknowledge that it hits us on various different levels, and we're hoping to acknowledge these levels in this presentation. First of all, it's unavoidably emotional. You know, it makes me want to cry when I watch it, because it's so intense, the courage and the determination in the face of the obscenity of racism. And at the same time, it's an intensely moral tale. It's about people standing up for what's right and deciding that that's what they want to do in their life. So it's a very spiritual and moral sort of thing as well. And thirdly, it's also intensely political. It's about the abuse of power. So if you read about this episode, you'll find that people's motivations move between those three different areas. And I think we'll all find ourselves relating to it on those three different levels during this call. The last thing I just want to say before we start is, again, to reiterate that myself and Rowan we're knowledgeable about all this stuff, right? But we're obviously just giving our own interpretations. And I think what we're trying to do is provoke you as much as inform you. You know, this is what we're seeing from our knowledgeable viewpoint, as it were, but it's by no means the last word, in so much as there's ever the last word on a historical episode. So we're producing, we're doing this session from a point of view of humility and service, and that's, I think, how we want to approach it. We're going to watch different clips, and either me or Rowan are going to speak about them, and then we'll give a little summary at the end. So it's a bit of flying tour of the video. So I think there's two clips I'm going to deal with, isn't it, David? So do you want to, let's get going and I'll speak about those.
I wish to apply for acceptance as a participant in CORE's Freedom Ride, 1961.
To travel via bus from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, Louisiana, and to test and challenge segregated
facilities en route. I understand that I should be participating in a nonviolent protest
against racial discrimination, that arrest or personal injury to me might result.
The Freedom Rides of 1961 were a simple but daring plan. The Congress of Racial Equality came up with the idea to put blacks and whites in small groups on commercial buses, and they would deliberately violate the segregation laws of the Deep South.
We were to go through various parts of the South, gradually going deeper and deeper. 6 of us on the Trailways bus and 6 of us on the Greyhound bus, and see whether places were segregated, whether people were being served when they went to get something to eat or buy a ticket or use the restrooms.
One of the major thrusts of the Freedom Ride was to get the movement into the Deep South. Most of the action up to this time had been in the Upper South or in the North. And one of the ideas here was to go into the deepest South. We were hoping that this would start a national movement.
CORE had this set itinerary. They anticipated that this would be a 2-week trip, that it would culminate down in New Orleans with a real celebration on the anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And there's almost an element of naivete attached to it, how easily they thought it would go.
I'm a senior at American Baptist Theological Seminary and hope to graduate in June. I know that an education is important, and I hope to get one. But at this time, human dignity is the most important thing in my life. That justice and freedom might come to the Deep South.
So that's an initial setting of the scene, as you might say. And I just want to draw out a few, what I see, crucial elements in what the Freedom Riders was about. Like, firstly, you'll notice this was not a major decision by a massive movement. It was a very small organization, in some ways similar to the Insulate Britain Project, where a number of people decided to directly confront the injustice at the heart of that injustice in the Deep South. And as such, there was a certain, as the guy says, naivety, right? And you often find this in movements or people that change history, is that they are not concerned with the cynical sort of analysis, right? Of what could happen, should happen, what to be careful about. There was a really simple recognition that obscene injustice was happening and that people wanted to challenge that in the most direct way because they stood for human dignity. And that's really the starting point here of what we're talking about today, I would suggest. Okay, do you want to do the next one?
I have no doubt that the Negro basically knows that the best friend he's ever had in the world is a Southern white man.
We talk about it here as separation of the races. Customs and traditions that have been built up over the last 100 years that have proved for the best interests of both the colored and the white people. There's not been one single change.
The colored man knows where he stands. The white man knows where he stands. We have signs saying colored and white. The colored man knows that he is not to enter there.
Well, a nigger's all right in his place, but they've always been behind us, and just tell you the truth, I want them always to stay behind me, because I never have loved a nigger, mister.
You cannot change a way of life overnight. The more they try to force us into doing something, then the worse the reaction will be.
Our colored people will do exactly as they've done. Our white people will do exactly as they've done. Why? Because it's worked out best.
It was all-encompassing, this so-called Southern way of life, would not allow for any breaks. It was a system that was only as strong, the white Southerners thought, as its weakest link. So you couldn't allow people even to sit together on the front of a bus, something that really shouldn't have threatened anyone, but it did. It threatened their sense of the wholeness, the sanctity of what they saw as an age-old tradition.
Travel in the segregated South for Black people was humiliating. The very fact that there were separate facilities was to say to Black people and white people that Blacks were so subhuman and so inferior that we could not even use public facilities that white people used. The Supreme Court even said that there was no right that a Black person had that white people had to respect.
You didn't know what you were going to encounter. You had night riders, you had hoodlums. You could be antagonized at any point in your journey. So most of the time, it was very, very difficult to plan a trip. And, you always had to meet someone to meet you there because you didn't know what to expect.
Okay, so this second clip is really setting the scene. And there's a really important point here to be made, which is when people look at the history of political change, when you look at it from hindsight, there's always a tendency to think that it was inevitable that the good guys would win. But what you find when you look more closely at these episodes is the ridiculously overwhelming obscenity of injustice and the sense that it's never going to change, right? It's never going to change. Like in the Gandhi episode, the British had been in India for for 200 years. How the hell were we ever going to get rid of colonialism? And in the American South, as you can see, since the American Civil War, there've been 90 years of structural, obscene racism. And it was embedded. There was no chance of changing it. That was the average attitude of the average American. And I think the key point here is that we live in a society now which has a massive sense that we're never going to decarbonize in time, right? You know, you saw in that clip, all that self-justification, you know, this has always been the way. This is always going to be the way. And we see this all the time with politicians today saying, we simply can't change the economy. We can't change society. There's too much sacrifice. There's too much privilege to be challenged, right? And you see this cynicism and defeatism within the climate movement, of course, and also, you know, in the opposition. There's absolutely nothing unusual about this. And just to connect with the earlier clip, the essential element in political change here is to ignore that sort of sensibleness, right? This is where the naivety comes in. We don't care that it's never going to change. We're going to challenge it anyway. And this is the spirit of the people that change history. So this is the challenge we've got today with the carbon way of life as we're talking about it. Yeah. So there's a final setting of the scene, isn't there?
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
When John Kennedy was elected in November of 1960, there was great hope and expectation that things would be better on matters of civil rights. That was a contrast between him and Dwight Eisenhower. He was young and had ideas and talked about the new frontier. But when he gave his inaugural address in January of 1961, he talked about spreading freedom all over the world, to China, to Latin America, to Africa, to everywhere but Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia.
The base of the Democratic Party was the essentially white voting South. The Kennedys had to be careful about antagonizing Southern governors and the whole Southern establishment, which was segregationist.
I was the first governor in the South that publicly endorsed him for president.
I think he's a person who is sympathetic to the problems and conditions in the South. I think he's a man who will work with us down here to help us.
I knew that you couldn't run for president on a segregation ticket. I knew that. But I felt like that if we ever got in a situation where we needed some understanding and some help from the federal government in regard to our problems down here, that I'd get an audience.
The entire nation will be looking at us on election day and will judge the way we feel about the segregation question by the size of the Democratic vote on November the 4th. Let's turn out the largest Democratic vote in the history of the state and show the people of this nation that we're not going to tolerate integration of the races 1 minute.
The Kennedys, when they came into office, were not worried about civil rights. They were worried about the Soviet Union. They were worried about the Cold War. They were worried about the nuclear threat. When civil rights did pop up, they regarded it as a bit of a nuisance, as something that was getting in the way of their agenda.
It became clear that the civil rights leaders had to do something desperate, something dramatic to get the Kennedys' attention. So that was the idea behind the Freedom Rides, to essentially dare the federal government to do what it was supposed to do and see if their constitutional rights will be protected by the Kennedy administration.
Okay, so welcome to the dastardly world of power politics. Right, I mean, what we see in this clip is a pattern that's replicated over and over again by politicians lying to the public about their ethical principles. And what we see, again, in the sort of sanitized version of civil rights movement in the 60s, it's like the Kennedys were supporting Martin Luther King and everyone trundled along, you know, towards progress. Absolutely not. The Kennedys didn't give a damn about civil rights, right? There were northern liberals. They got into power through the Dixie vote. In other words, the vote of the racists in the white racists in the American South. And if you read the book about it, another quote about it is they thought civil rights was an afterthought on an afterthought, right? Domestic affairs were an afterthought, and an afterthought on the afterthought was the civil rights movement. Okay, that didn't stop them making all the right noises. The politicians always make the right noises because that's the business they're in. So there's a direct correlation here between the 30 years of the politicians on the right and the left saying they care about the climate and all the rest of it, but not doing anything about it. And it's this point of we are going to do something that's dramatic and desperate because we have to wake them up. This is the point of revelation that always happens in civil resistance struggles, in classical nonviolence. It's that point when you realize that the politicians are bullshitting in a structural way, not in an off way. So we know, like with Boris Johnson, what he's saying is he's been saying it for 10 years, is green is good. All the politicians are saying green is good, and he's going to have all the targets and all the right statements, but nothing's going to happen. And it's exactly the same in the civil rights movement in the 60s. You know, they'd say the right things, they'd even pass a few laws, but they wouldn't implement them. And that's exactly what's happening. And the other thing to draw out of this clip, I think, is the complete corruption of the political sphere. You know, the privileged power of the ruling class, white ruling class in the American South had the ear of Kennedy. That's why they supported him. That they were there to have an understanding, right? An understanding is corruption. That they would get an audience. In other words, they were really in charge, right? They were really in charge of the administration. And that's exactly the same today if you talk to the government insiders who are saying they'll make all the sorts of statements, you know, on the green economy, but at the end of the day, it's the corporate bosses who are going to phone up Boris Johnson and say, look, you know, you can't do that. You're going to, you know, lose our support. So you can see on these 3 clips, you know, the basic background and the way of life and the corruption of the political sphere. These are all the sort of groundings, really, upon which the Freedom Riders took place and the basis on which there's some direct similarities with Insulate Britain. So I'm going to pass over to Rowan in terms of what actually happened.
Okay, so shall we start with the clip?
May I have a cup of coffee, please?
Now, look, I don't want any niggers in here.
Nigger, what are you doing in here? Don't you know?
The training that we did in Washington, D.C. prior to the time the writers got on the buses was largely devoted to trying to see how the person is going to react.
Are you with this fella?
Why, yes, we're both interstate bus passengers.
Where are you from?
I'm from the United States.
By using nonviolence, people see the contrast between your dignified, disciplined confrontation of the wrong and then the reaction of violence. No way of confusing that confrontation.
You move?
No, I don't move when I'm in the right.
Well, then we'll
The Freedom Rides, I think, typified one of the standard contradictions within the civil rights movement. On the one hand, it's nonviolent, doesn't hit back when hit. On the other hand, they're really courting violence in order to attract publicity that will forward the cause. And so you have these mixed motives. Let's hope nothing happens, nobody's hurt. On the other hand, suppose something does happen, wouldn't that in an ironic way be good for us?
Get out. Move out. This is
People at CORE thought maybe some bad things will happen, but I don't think they imagined anywhere near the kind of level of violence that they'd meet in Anniston and Birmingham and in Montgomery.
It was make-believe, and it did not scare me, perhaps because it was make-believe, and I wasn't sure I'd really have to use all these techniques. With our nonviolent behavior and our goodwill, I thought we could do anything.
The thing that we can really see very clearly in this in this clip is the importance of confrontation in nonviolence. And people very often think of nonviolence as being something very passive and gentle, but it has to have some grit and some traction and some tension in it if there's going to be any change. An example that I often use is stringing a stringed instrument, a musical instrument. You know, you need to have the strings at the right tension. So if you have them too tight, you know, that's equivalent to too aggressive or edging into violence. If you have them too loose, then it's too passive and it's not going to create any change. So you need to get that tension just right so that it makes the music. So the other thing, another thing that the clip shows quite nicely, I think, is the difference between a principled or a faith-based approach to action and a more strategic approach. So there's a guy who speaks retrospectively about how there was this need to court violence, and that by courting violence you can confront. So that's a good example of a strategic attitude to the approach. And the riders hadn't at that point learned about the strategy of courting violence to the extent that it actually played out. So it was actually much worse than they imagined it would be. So you might wonder, if they'd fully realized what was coming at them, would they have been up for it? And my sense is that for some people, as the risk increases, the strategic approach doesn't really cut it. They're not so up for taking a risk of something like violence or prison for the sake of a strategy, but they will do it for a principle or as an expression of their faith. And this is where action, you know, for them, they frame it as poetry or as prayer or as meditation. And those people will take those risks in the knowledge that this is what reaches deeper and further into people's hearts and minds to precipitate a deeper change. And these two approaches are not mutually exclusive, or they often are. Just people tend to go for one or the other, but you can actually do both. You can hold a strategy within the context of a more principled approach. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the principled approach, because I feel that has not been addressed so much generally in the climate movement up to now. So in this approach, we accept and are willingly vulnerable to the risk. And there's a sacrifice and a depth of commitment that brings in higher values, such as solemnity, of courage, and of a sense of meaning even. And you see in the clip, this Reverend Lawson, he talks about how the way that they confront shows their dignity, and that even when they're attacked, this confronts even more, that these are people who are worthy of honor and respect. And this shows how, for me, I see nonviolence almost like having a kind of gravitational pull. So almost without doing anything, you know, or the little that we do, it accrues these higher values like honor and respect, trust, empathy, compassion, or even, or inspiration. And it seems that the higher the risk that people take, the stronger those values become. And this can happen so powerfully that it can create not just a sort of social change, but a whole paradigm shift is possible, which I think, you know, happened as a result of the civil rights movement. So I want to look at how does this work? How does nonviolence do this? And I've got 3 points I want to make. So one, I just realized I didn't time myself, damn it. So the first one is about sacrifice. So this is going beyond the ordinary. It's bringing a sense of meaning. It's making, for people of faith, it's about making what we do sacred, making it like a prayer. and to bring meaning to an otherwise uncaring, flat kind of a world that sucks the meaning out of everything. That is going beyond politics into the territory of what it means to be a human being. The second one is about non-violence engaging in higher risk actions, bringing a kind of a dimensionalness to the actions. And, you know, to just talk about it in kind of dimensional terms, you've got the horizontal axis, which is like the strategic gains of an action being effective, and you're looking at it just in terms of effectiveness. So you've got that there. But there's also a vertical aspect, which is, you know, on the one hand, reaching up towards what's possible, and to, you know, to humans pushing beyond, you know, trying to push beyond what they're capable of, and yet also is deeply grounding and offering stability and trying to be rooted. So that's the vertical aspect. And then you've got a depth that calls and invites a longing for a better world that's possible. And in doing this, moves people's hearts. And we ourselves as activists start to believe it ourselves. And in that process, we invite others to dare to believe it too. So those two things are happening simultaneously, that we get changed ourselves by our actions, and that's part of what creates the change in the world. And then thirdly, there's a way in which non-violence, with non-violence, you kind of create and discover the action simultaneously. And it's a bit like alchemy. So in actions, you might be familiar, in XR, we create a non-violent container out of which the action can come. And be strong and stable, and, you know, we can create the confrontation in that context, and it kind of acts a bit like a crucible, and a crucible can take high temperatures, so that's the intensity that comes with non-violent action. And then we feed into the crucible these qualities and higher values of non-violence, like dignity, humility, trustworthiness, caring, being respectful, and of course the confronting and exposing of injustice. And that's part of this creating part. And then we have the discovery, which is that we have much, much more than we started out with, or fed into that crucible. So it brings emergent properties. If you're into systems theory, you'll be familiar with that term. And we find courage that we didn't know we had, and we have camaraderie and trust in each other, and unexpected joy, and so on. So a couple of the riders, they talk about how unprepared they were to the violence that was coming, and like so many activists, were somewhat naive. But in the case of non-violence, the naivety is like an example of one of the emergent properties. It gets transformed into a higher value in the crucible of non-violence, and becomes a source of power. And I'll talk a bit more about that later in the later on clip. So, and also later in the film, we see how the riders also discover that the action kind of takes on a life of its own, and they become players in this great drama that's unfolding. And then at this point, everything is getting transmuted in this crucible. Okay, let's move to the next clip now.
Eventually, we heard that sickening sound of tires going flat.
There was a commotion outside. So I walked to the front of the store to see if I could tell what was going on. The bus driver came out, and he went out to look at the tires, and when he realized how flat and hopeless they were, he just walked away from the bus and just left all the passengers to fend for themselves. He just walked away.
We were now in the hands of this mob. It didn't look good for us.
I'm like everyone else on the bus. I'm pretty afraid, okay? That's putting it mildly.
I watched as a man raised his arm above the crowd with a crowbar, and he broke out one of the back windows of the bus.
You could hear him say, throw it in, and asking, where is the gas, where is the gas?
The hand went down, and when it came back up, it had some object in it that he threw into that hole.
And there was immediate flash fire on the bus.
Pretty soon, the whole back of the bus was black. You couldn't even see in front of your face.
So I ran up to the front of the bus, and I tried to open the door. Only thing I could hear is, let's burn them niggers. Let's burn them niggers alive. At that moment, the fuel tank exploded. I heard somebody say, it's gonna go, it's gonna go. And they ran, and that was the only way we could get that door open.
The door burst open and people just spilled out into the yard. They were practically tripping over each other because they were so sick and they needed to get some air.
I can't tell you if I walked off the bus or if I crawled off or someone pulled me off.
When I got off the bus, a man came up to me, and I'm coughing and strangling. He said, boy, you all right? And I nodded my head, and the next thing I knew, I was on the ground. He had hit me with part of a baseball bat.
People were gagging and they were crawling around on the ground. They were trying to get the smoke out of their chest. It was just an awful, 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 awful scene.
It was horrible. It was like a scene from hell. It was the worst suffering I'd ever heard. Yeah, I heard water. Please give me water. Oh God, I need water. I walked right out into the middle of that crowd. I picked me out one person. I washed her face. I held her. I gave her water to drink. And as soon as I thought she was going to be okay, I got up and picked out somebody else.
As I'm getting up off the ground, 4 or 5 guys coming at me again. And this is when I see the highway patrolman. He pulls his gun and he fired in the air. He says, okay, you've had your fun. Let's move back. And that's what stopped it.
When the bus pulled up, there was a mob, looking like 1,000 people. They had these iron pipes.
James Peck and I, we were scheduled to test the facilities. So he looked at me and I looked at him, and we proceeded to go into the terminal.
I looked at the reporter. When our eyes met and he looked away, it just, I don't know, my guts, my very guts shook. He must have thought we were doomed.
As we entered, we were met by hoodlums who were standing around the walls.
The very first thing that I saw was a white man. And he was hollering, no, people don't do it. They are my brothers, they're your brothers. Before I let you kill them, you have to kill me first. Klansmen made the statement, well, fuck it, that ain't no problem. At that time, all hell broke loose.
I was thrown forward. I was hit on the back of the head with something.
It was a mass brawl. Sticks, bats, clubs, guns, just swinging away, just swinging away.
James went down almost immediately. The blood started running.
black woman run up to a city detective and holler, "They're killing my husband, for God's sakes help me," turned and slapped her down, knocked the hell out of her.
And this flashbulb went off. I believe the flashbulb may have saved my life because they turned on the report.
They knocked one man, a white man, down at my feet, and they beat him and kicked him until his face was a bloody red pulp. The police did not arrive at the scene until 10 minutes late, when these men had, as if on signal, dispersed and had gone further down the street, where I saw some of them discussing their achievement of the day right under the windows of the police commissioner's office.
So yeah, in this clip you can see there's been a massive shift of gear, and you can see, you can really see how naive those folks were from the beginning of the action to what they've been met with in these two clips. And you can really see how incredibly vulnerable they are in the face of so much brutality, and the challenge to remain non-violent in that. And this is perhaps easier to see in the second clip than in the first clip, but you see how their vulnerability is actually a source of power. So it's not like the vulnerability is the aim, although from a strategic point of view, you know, you might try to use it in that way. But it's the inevitable effect of opening yourself up to the consequences that really avails us of incredible power if we're able to make use of it. And the reason this works is because people see our willingness to be vulnerable, and that this speaks to people much more deeply, and more deeply the bigger the risk, or the bigger the consequences that we face. And they see our humanity. They see we feel fear. They're just like them, and yet this action, they see that this action to us is even more important to us than our fears. So it's a kind of a paradox that it's in the vulnerability that the power lies, because it's in the risk, because without risk we can lose nothing, and therefore we can prove nothing, because we can't so effectively demonstrate our strength of feeling, and we can demonstrate the strength of our convictions by this being visibly vulnerable, and it's in this state that we can accrue those higher values of honor and respect, or incredible awe for anyone that saw that, and the trust and sense of duty that people bring to the action. And all of this brings an incredible gravity to ourselves as activists, but also to what we're standing for. And meanwhile, especially in the second one, we get a sense that the whole world is watching all this. In fact, that phrase is used. And the world becomes vulnerable to our vulnerability. So this is where the flat world out there, it gets pulled into our more dimensional world. Okay, hand over to you, Roger, now for the next one.
My phone, the hotel room rings, and it's the Attorney General. He has received word from the FBI in Nashville that another wave of Freedom Riders is coming down to Birmingham from Nashville to continue the Freedom Rides. And he opens the conversation. Who the hell is Diane Nash?
It was clear to me that if we allowed the Freedom Ride to stop at that point, just after so much violence had been inflicted, the message would have been sent that all you have to do to stop a nonviolent campaign is inflict massive violence. It was critical that the Freedom Ride not stop and that it be continued immediately.
Students from the movement in Nashville had been through violence, we had been arrested, we'd all had our lives threatened. We were ones that had not broken, and we were the logical ones to continue the ride.
We had had a successful movement the year before and had desegregated lunch counters. We had been watching the progress of the Freedom Ride. We were fresh troops.
Core, I think, they didn't understand. We deal with violence every day in the South. They didn't treat us like we were human. They treated us like vicious animals. Like they were always on guard, thinking that we're gonna do something to them while they were doing it to us. And Core, I think, they felt we'll go down there and, they'll let us ride the front of the bus and go into the white station, the white waiting room, and everything will be all right. We'll just go all the way to New Orleans and doing this, and then come back to New York and see we did it. It wasn't like that. You're saying that you're going to start a movement, you're going to do something to change this, and then you quit. Your parents tell you, don't start something that you can't finish. Finish it.
Groups would be dispatched.
The meeting was called, and Diane led it, and I remember Diane saying something was very important. She took a break and said, go out and let's think about it for about 10 minutes and come back, and we'll make the decision.
It was not an easy decision because what it meant was dropping out of school in the midst of our final exams. And for some of us, we were the first generation to go to college. Our parents had really made sacrifices, and we were making a decision to drop out.
Time was up. Everybody came back in. The decision was made to leave that night.
My parents had provided me a wonderful childhood and a tremendous amount of love and support in everything that I had done. But as a white person, I was the primary focus of most of the violence that took place because I was a disgrace to the white race. I was the traitor. So I knew if anybody was probably going to get pretty well beaten or killed, it would be me. And I wanted to tell my folks how much I loved them and how much I appreciated what they'd done. Tuesday, May 16th, 1961. We held two meetings today. The first was at 6 this morning, the second from 7 to 1 tonight. After much discussion, we decided to continue the Freedom Ride. Of the 18 who volunteered, 10 were chosen. 3 females and 7 males. We will leave on the Greyhound bus tomorrow morning at either 5:15 or 6:45. We were all again made aware of what we can expect to face: jail, extreme violence, or death.
We thought we would divide the group in half. That group had been arrested, beaten, unable to continue, or even killed. We had a second group that was ready to go. And they knew that no matter what happened, okay, I would bring the second group.
The people who were going on the Freedom Ride from Nashville elected me to be the coordinator. That was a really heavy responsibility because the lives and safety of people whom I loved and cared about deeply, who were some of my closest friends, depended on my doing a good job at that.
In this clip, you really see the essence of what nonviolence is and how it works, in my view. And the first point to make, I think, is just following on from what Rowan says, is there's a miraculous, paradoxical element to classical nonviolence, which is it completely turns around the relationships of power. The vulnerability is the greatest source of power when facing injustice. That's the proposition. And you can see that dynamic happening here, that it was the example of that extreme vulnerability, the willingness to sacrifice, that spurred on the mobilization of other people to follow. So the very vulnerability is the source of power. And you can juxtapose that with the fury of the Kennedy administration, who are completely socialized into the traditional view of power, which is, you know, the bad guy's in control and everyone else jumps to it. So they can't understand, they literally cannot understand why it's carrying on, because they don't understand how the nonviolent process works, hence their fury. And you see this over and over again at this point of the transfer of power from the powerful, inverted commas, to the powerless. And it's one of the most dramatic and fantastic sort of penny drops moments for activists when they realize that regardless of your social power, you have a body and you have courage, and you can change the world through using your body and through your courage. And this is not some, you know, it's not some idealistic philosophy. It's completely grounded in these historical processes. The other thing to take from this, I think, is this absolute determination not to lose. And this is something that's missing very much from modern activist culture, where people go and do an action and then they go home, right? Classical nonviolence does not accept defeat because it can't, right? Because we've gone too far and too much is at stake. So it's incredible to think that this process took 3 days, right? Those people were beaten up, and 3 days later, another group of people on the go. There wasn't some big consultation process, right? There wasn't a conference. There wasn't a big phone call sort of situation, right? Diana Nash stood up in front of those activists in Nashville and said, we're going down there, go out and decide whether you want to join. And this is how political change works. It's about the emotionality of sacrifice creating a backfiring effect, which then promotes and enables other people to step into that position. And then they go through the same process. And then it happens again. It's a domino process. And it's essentially a spiritual process. You know, whether you're secular or religious, you have to accept that it's not about calculation. It's about connection, emotional connection and spiritual connection with what is the right thing to do. And as the guy says, right, the essential notion here is if you start something, you finish it, right? So the challenge for us out of this is when we go and do this campaign in the autumn for Insulate Britain, it's not let's go and ask for something. We're not going to stop. That's the challenge. right? There's no time to allow for defeat. And we all know that in 2021. And these guys knew it in 1961 because they knew that the institutionalized obscene racism would reinvigorate itself to the extent that they failed. So they were in a position where they couldn't afford to lose. In the same way as this autumn before COP, we simply cannot afford to lose. We have to do whatever is non-violently necessary. And you can see this intense emotion happening, you know, with the white guy, right? Who's you know, he had a great upbringing, but he knows what the score is and he knows what he has to do. So, yeah, it's a big clip. I'll pass on to Rowan.
After the arrests in Jackson, Ross Barnett decided to send them to Parchman Prison. Parchman was the most dreaded prison in the South. William Faulkner, in one of his novels, called it Destination Doom.
Ross Barnett wants to teach them a lesson. And the lesson is, I'm going to send you to a real prison, to Parchman Penitentiary. So you're going to do hard time in Mississippi. You're not going to, this is not going to be a city jail. This is going to be like the reputation of the Old South, where people did work gangs.
I would write the governor, but that'll do no good. I would write the governor, but that'll do no good.
Ross Barnett thought that he could intimidate them, that just the thought of Parchman would scare people to death, and that this would break the back of the Freedom Rider movement.
We were taken into this dark building. We had to strip and get examined, a vaginal exam. Matrons had on rubber gloves and would dip them into what smelled sort of like Lysol or some concoction like that. And then they'd gouge up us and back into the Lysol or whatever it was and on to the next one. And that was really intimidating. Showed they could do anything they wanted to us, and probably would.
Suddenly he asked me, "Do you have syphilis?" I said no, and kind of laughed, quite like I'm doing now. Boy, that was the key. They jumped on me. But as they attacked, blood spouted. And when the blood spouted, they all jumped back, because they weren't supposed to do that. The idea was to bruise, not to bleed.
Ross Barnett thinks that he has the ultimate move on the chessboard by sending them to Parchman Farm. So Freedom Riders take the pretty brave stand of saying, fine, we'll go to Parchman, and we'll fill Parchman up, and we'll make Parchman the next site of the civil rights movement.
We must now fill the jail and be willing to remain for at least a minimum of 60 days or more.
It became a continuation of the Freedom Ride. Parchman becomes every much a location in the Freedom Rides as the bus depots themselves.
I'd like to see the show of hands of those of you who will be willing to continue the Freedom Ride in the near future. Put them up high, please.
We made up a song saying that buses are coming. And we sang it to the jailers to tell them and warn them to get ready, to be prepared, that we were not the only ones coming. So we started singing, buses are a-coming, oh yes. Buses are a-coming, oh yes. Buses are a-coming, buses are a-coming, buses are a-coming, oh yes. We say to the jailers, better get you ready, oh yes. The jailers say, all right, shut up on that singing and hollering in here. This is not no playhouse, this is the jailhouse.
Yeah, so this shows what happens if you try to humiliate people. And if you don't break them, what's going to happen is that they're going to gain strength from that experience, from humility. And then that humility becomes another of these higher values that get transformed in the crucible, as it were. And so, you know, if you're undeterred by punishment, what that means is that we take the punishment out of our own minds, because that's where it is. Most of the time, as we're going about our lives, we're obedient. And we're being controlled all the time by our fear of punishment. It may not be very obvious to us, but that's what's happening. Especially more we try to challenge the status quo. So if you're undeterred by punishment, you take that out of your mind, and you no longer have internalized it, so you can't be controlled. And this is a profound challenge to the status quo. And the stick doesn't work, and neither does the carrot, because business as usual also doesn't work on us, because we don't seem to care about being deprived of consumerism and holidays and luxury living and all these things that they try to keep us hooked in by. So they have no way to control us, and we just keep going. And this is what can break the power in the end. And you know, also the process that as we do this, we're calling others all the time. They're called by the, you know, feeling moved by what we do, and they see the power that we have, and they get called in to join in with us, hopefully. Okay, over to Roger.
Buses are a-coming, oh yes. Buses are a-coming, oh yes. Buses are a-coming, buses are a-coming, buses are a-coming, oh yes.
I got up one morning in May, and I said to my folks at home, I won't be back today because I'm a freedom rider. It was like a wave or wind that you didn't know where it was coming from or where it was going, but you knew you were supposed to be there. Nobody asked me. Nobody told me. It was like putting yeast in bread. It was a leavening effect.
Buses are a-coming, oh yes. Buses are a-coming, buses are a-coming, buses are a-coming.
What are you going to do this summer? Well, you can go do some, you know, menial, low-paying job, or you can go on the freedom rides.
Coming through Alabama.
I think a lot of us, we were past fear. We can't stop. If one person falls, others take their place.
Coming through Alabama, oh yes.
They wanted to have people of different religions. We started out with 14 Protestant ministers, 8 white and 6 black, and 4 Reform rabbis. And we wound up with 10 of us getting arrested.
We cannot submit to immoral laws which demand that we separate racially. Nor can we conscientiously avoid entirely the situations in which these segregationist laws operate contrary to the laws of the land.
Jackson, oh yes. Rolling in the Jackson, rolling in the Jackson. Buses are a-coming, oh yes.
As the Freedom Rider leaders called for more freedom rides going into Mississippi, Bobby Kennedy decided to go formally to the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, and to ask them for a sweeping desegregation order. As Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy didn't have the power to take down the Jim Crow signs. Only the ICC did.
Now the matter is before the ICC. We have taken action in the government to try to end segregation in all of these facilities. It seems to me that that's the proper place for it to be. I don't see that the Freedom Riders now, who are so-called Freedom Riders, who are making these trips, accomplish a great deal. I question their wisdom. I don't question their legal right to travel, but I question their wisdom. I think that some people can get hurt, innocent people that don't have anything to do with this.
Bobby Kennedy hoped that he could go to the Freedom Rider leaders and say, look, I've made this move. Those signs are going to come down eventually. Why don't you call off the Freedom Rides?
Robert Kennedy calls for this cooling off process, and the Freedom Riders say no. And in fact, they pick up the Freedom Rides. They intensify the whole project, and they have people coming in from all across the country to participate. And they're coming in by plane, and they're coming in by bus, and they're coming in by train.
Well, as this train rolls on toward Jackson, Mississippi, do you have any second thoughts with regard to this effort you're taking?
No, none at all.
Even though we came from many different places and we had many different cultures and many different home environments, in some ways we were very much unified because we had a common cause and we were all moving in that direction, and we did believe in what we were doing. We knew that we had taken a stand and that it was going to be better. There was something better out there for us.
What made you want to take part in this?
I want to help break down this barrier of segregation.
How about you? Can you give me any of your feelings on why you want to take part in this?
Well, I want to help establish the right of all Americans to eat together and to travel together.
Why do you think it's your responsibility?
I think it's every American's responsibility. I only think that some are more conscious of their responsibility than others.
Eventually, there were over 430 Freedom Riders, 300 of whom ended up at Parchman. At Parchman, they began to see the movement in a new way. It became almost a university of nonviolence. They became not just individual groups of Freedom Riders, but they had a shared experience. And they were from different parts of the country, there were different races, different religions, in some cases different political philosophies, and it all got blended together. They became tougher. They became even more committed. They became the shock troops of the movement.
The people that took a seat on these buses, that went to jail in Jackson, that went to Parchman, they were never the same. We had moments there to learn, to teach each other the way of nonviolence, the way of love, the way of peace. The Freedom Ride created an unbelievable sense, yes, we will make it, yes, we will survive, and that nothing but nothing was going to stop this movement.
Finally, on September 22nd, after hundreds of arrests, the ICC issued its order. It gave the Freedom Riders what they've been asking for. The colored-only, the whites-only signs that had been in the bus and rail stations for generations, they finally came down.
Just to continue the theme, I suppose, of what myself and Rowan are saying is there's a central paradox here, which is the vulnerability of classical nonviolence produces the mobilization that then brings you towards a political and strategic success. But it starts off with that spiritual basis of doing the right thing and standing up for human dignity as an end in itself. And it's that very example, the dramatization of that moral commitment, which drives the strategic logic of nonviolence, which is encourages and drives other people to step up. And that's really what you see here. And I want to just make the point about this paradox in terms of sacrifice, because a lot of materialistic people you know, who've been brought up in this Western culture of seeing everything as a cost-benefit analysis, think that when you talk about non-violence, you're talking about sacrifice. But the fact of the matter is the sacrifice is not a sacrifice, because it's a mechanism towards spiritual and moral growth, which is the central purpose of existing, right, in this life. You see what I mean? What this really challenges is our whole, you know, debased culture of thinking the way to live our life is to play safe. It's not. You know, we know in 2021, playing safe equals the most horrendous risk-taking, right? We're not risk-taking here. We're on a spiritual journey to some sort of wholeness. And this is the central point, that sacrifice is not the sacrifice, right? It turns out to actually be smart. And similarly, the second paradox is that the impotence is shown to not be impotent, right? You can be impotent, but through non-violence, you show you have enormous material power. So the strategic sort of follow-on from this is the two things you probably noticed there is the continuation of the campaign. So one of the biggest strategic mistakes non-violence campaigns do is they have a cooling off process, because all the liberals, you know, the Kennedys of this world say, oh yeah, you've made your point, you can cool off now, we don't want more people to be hurt, we don't want third parties involved. No, the absolute imperative of classical non-violence is to continue until the victory is achieved, right? There's no cooling off process. There's no, let's sit in the road in September and then we'll carry on again in March. It has to be continuous. And that's what drives the material force, as it were, of the strategic point of non-violence, where you get to the 430 people in prison and then you get the success. And the success is not just an external success, right? In many ways, desegregating the interstate buses was a minor victory. The real story here is the complete transformation of the people who took part, right? They became, as the guy said, the shock troops of the movement. Those 430 people, they're all people who drove the civil rights movement to its spectacular successes over the following 8 to 10 years. And the second thing, the other thing is that episode established the methodology of classical nonviolence within the American South. And that, as I've said in previous presentations, is what led to the real massive successes of Selma and Birmingham, which are, you know, the headline points of the civil rights movement. So that's the story, I guess. Rowan, do you want to say a few things? And I just want to make a little point at the end, and then we'll finish.
Yes, this is my kind of comment on the whole film, really, not just the clips. And that what strikes me most about the whole story is that these people, and you see that these photos in the last clip, the photos of all those people, little, you know, like photo booth photos, they are like. And these are our ancestors. These are the people that blazed the trail with non-violence. And, you know, yes, now it's our turn, but the stakes are so high now, because if we fail, all of that gets snuffed out. It's not just us that gets snuffed out. It's the memory. It's everything that anyone has ever done, you know, in non-violence or any kind of, you know, right over might kind of victory. It all gets snuffed out. And so for me, the failing of our history and our ancestors is most shameful and painful. And that's what pushes me. But what I thrive on and what pulls me is the inspiration that I feel in what they've given, and the victory in their willingness to act. Never mind what they achieved, just the courage in acting itself is enough for me. And you know, watching this film, I feel like we get defined by these people, in who we are now as activists. They define us even before I knew anything about them. And their influence is not confined by history. They're kind of timeless, and they're still defining us. So, you know, we get to honor all that they gave by taking up the torch. That's the only way, really, that we can honor them. And when you think of what's at stake, then it, you know, what it means to be human, really. There's no choice but to act, really. But we can feel them standing with us. You know, I feel them standing behind me all the way, and I get a lot of strength from that. That's me.
Thanks, Rona. I just want to just make a final point as well, which is, you know, there's this tension, as you probably noticed throughout this whole presentation, between the moral and the strategic, as Rona said. And the central strategic point here is, and I said this 4 or 5 years ago at the beginning of the XR process, when I was invited to talk to climate activists, I said, we're simply not going to win unless we engage in classical nonviolence. And that's even more true today in 2021. You can see in this historical example, the absolute determination to do whatever is necessary, to sacrifice to whatever extent is necessary in order to win, right? As well as the sort of moral imperative. And I think that's my appeal to you all. And that's what you have to appeal to other people, is we have the absolute responsibility not to fail this autumn. I mean, it's a blunt message, I know, but that's what I want to say to you all as my final contribution. Thanks.
Buses are a-coming, oh yes. Buses are a-coming, oh yes. Buses are a-coming, buses are a-coming, buses are a-coming. Rolling into Jackson. Oh.